There's a prayer for everything. In this series, we've looked at the many Psalms that speak to all the different aspects of life experiences that we might have. When we're afraid, when we're disappointed, when we're angry, when we're weary, lonely, sick, whatever situation we find ourselves in, I promise you, there's at least one Psalm that speaks to each one of those. And we've looked at all of those. In each case, God meets our need. Whatever we ask for, whatever we need, He has a way of supplying it. It's not always the way we might expect it, but God answers those prayers. And so I think it's appropriate that we would end this series with a psalm of gratitude. What do we pray when we're grateful? I think a go-to place for songs of gratitude and praise is the fifth book of Psalms. As you know, the book of Psalms is divided into 5 books. The fifth book begins with Psalm 107, and that's going to be our psalm for this session as it introduces Book 5. The theme of Book 5, these 44 Psalms, longest book of the book of Psalms, is that God is worthy to be praised because God saves. Over and over again, these Psalms emphasize the salvation of God, whether it's saving Israel, whether it's saving the psalmist. There are songs of praise and thanks for God's acts of salvation. So Psalm 107 is a great introduction to that theme. Psalm 107 contains for us a cycle of 4 scenarios, 4 vignettes from which God saves. And in each case, there's a very clear pattern. First, there is a need for salvation. There's a situation that the psalmist is in where rescue and help is needed. And so they cry out. And when they cry out, God rescues. And when God rescues, they give thanks. And we'll see this cycle repeat itself 4 times. The 5th time will be a summary of all of this. But that's the structure of the psalm. It's a beautiful poetic structure with this repetition that reminds us of the many and varied ways in which God saves and the many ways that we can respond to Him in thanksgiving. The opening line of the psalm is the most common line in the book 5 of the book of Psalms, in these last Psalms. It's simply this: "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever." And so we're to give thanks, particularly for God's steadfast love. The Hebrew word for that is chesed. Chesed. It doesn't really translate directly into English as love. It needs to have some adjectives attached to it. It is committed love. It is loyal love. It is covenant love, steadfast love. Also includes the idea of kindness and mercy. There's a lot wrapped up in that word. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His chesed is enduring forever. There's no limit to it in its time or in its quantity. Verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. If you've been redeemed, if you've experienced God's rescue, redemption, then say so, declare it. This is a psalm that invites us to proclaim. For whom He has redeemed from trouble and gathered in from lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. His salvation is universal. Geographically speaking, we've got every corner of the globe covered here. Everyone has access, should have access to the saving power of God. The first group of people that particularly cry out and are rescued are the homeless and hungry. The homeless and the hungry. Read that in verse 4. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to a city to dwell in. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Today, we can look out and we see in our nation, even in our abundance, we still have the homeless. We still have the hungry. And it was certainly true in the ancient world. There were refugees, there were exiles, there were captives in battle. There were people moving all the time from place to place in search of food, in search of a place to live, a home, if you will. And even today, in our own city, we have the homeless and hungry. And they cry out, verse 6, to the Lord in their trouble, and He delivered them in their distress. He led them by a straight way until they reached a city to dwell in. They cried out, and the Lord delivered them. He took them, note this, to a city. They were wandering in the wilderness. He brought them to a city, to a community, to a place with other people, and he settled them there. You know, Jesus said that the church is that city on a hill, a light that is the light of the world that can't be hidden, that the church is meant to do this. Is one of the ways in which God answers the prayer of the homeless and hungry. In my hometown here, there's a lot of work that's done among the homeless and the hungry, and it is spearheaded by the church. The church is meant to be that city that the homeless and hungry can come to. God provides for them, and so they give thanks. In verse 8, it says, "Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. For he satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul he fills with good things." I love that satisfaction. It's not just that he fills them with food, but he satisfies them with good things, with what they really need, and that is home and security and community. It's all there. The second group of people that call out to God are those that are dying in prison. They're dying in prison. Verse 10, "Some sat in darkness and in the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons. For they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. And so he bowed their hearts down with hard labor. They fell down with none to help." The circumstances of those dying in prison are varied. Some may have been in exile, punished for their disobedience to God. Some may have been political prisoners. Some may have been debtors, criminals, unjustly imprisoned. There's all kinds of reasons that someone would find themselves in prison. In the ancient world, that was a terrible place to be. It was a place for punishment, for separation, and you didn't survive typically. Today, at least, the prisons attempt to reform and help and give people a second chance. But in the ancient world, it was the end. You were probably going to die in prison. So verse 13, "They cried out to the Lord in their trouble. He delivered them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and burst their bonds apart." God is a chain breaker. Think about the Old Testament, how Samson's chains break and he gets his vengeance, how Joseph moves from the prison to a palace, how Jesus cast out a legion of demons that have enslaved a man, how Paul and Silas broken out of prison from a Philippian jail. And I would say by extension that God also is a chain breaker when it comes to the addictions and habits and things that bind us. Sin is a prison. And in order to get out of that prison, we need help from the outside. We see that in verse 15. "Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. For he shatters the doors of bronze and cuts into the bars of iron." In the ancient world, I don't think you could cut bronze doors and bars of iron. You had to melt them. It took supernatural effort to do this, is the point, that God had to do this beyond what humans are capable of doing. And if we're to escape from the prisons, often of our own making, it's going to take help from the outside, and that is Yahweh. The third group of people that cry out for help are the sin sick. The sin sick. Verse 17, "Some were fools through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities suffered affliction. They loathed any kind of food. They drew near to the gates of death." Just as we said in the session on sin and sickness, that there was a connection there, that sin consequences were always sickness in the Old Testament. And this is here. They were foolish in their sinful ways. They made poor moral choices, and this resulted in sickness. And there's truth to this, that the sinful activities that we do, think of the 7 deadly sins, right? Sloth, gluttony, lust, greed, pride, envy, wrath. All of them have negative physical consequences as well as the spiritual consequences. But when we come to the end of the road with our sin and the sickness that it causes, verse 19, "They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them and delivered them from their destruction." He healed them. The Hebrew word there is Rapha. God is a healer. So verse 21, Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. Let them offer sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell of his deeds and songs of joy. They're to worship by offering sacrifices of thanksgiving, not required obligatory sacrifices, but thanksgiving sacrifices that came from the heart, genuine, heartfelt. They're to do this also with singing, as mentioned here as well, to write new songs, to tell of God's deliverance. The fourth group that cries out, I'm going to call them the stormy sea. The stormy sea. Verse 23, and some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. And here they're just going about their business, right? They just go down to the sea, they're fishing, they're doing commerce by water. They get to see the deeds of the Lord, the beauty of the ocean, of sunsets, of animals and creatures that are inhabiting that realm. And it's a wonderful thing, verses 23 and 24. But in verse 25, reminds us of the dangers as well. Verse 25, for he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled, they staggered like drunken men, were at their wits' end. All of a sudden, the calmness and the beauty of the ocean is transformed into a tempest. And the waves are lifting them up and bringing them back down. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the videos of modern ships out in the ocean. These are fascinating because there are waves out there 30, 40, 50 feet high, and there are massive ships, container ships, Coast Guard cutters. You can watch videos of these ships navigating those kinds of waters, and it's terrifying. And I think about the ancient world. Think about the 5th century, what it was like to go out in a wooden ship on the ocean. You were completely at the mercy of a storm. Every time you went up, you didn't know if you were going to come down for the last time. That's what he's describing here, is a life-threatening storm. And I think this particular group of people are not there because of sin, like they're because of their choices, as some of these others might have been. They're there just doing life. And that's sometimes what happens to us. For no fault of our own, we find ourselves thrust into the midst of a traumatic situation. We receive horrible news that we had no control over. It just happens to us. It's just the environment. That's the stormy sea environment. And they cry out to God in verse 28 in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. The same voice that caused the storm to rise in verse 25 calls it to be stilled in verse 29. They celebrate and they return home to their families. So, verse 31, let's give thanks to the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. Let them extol in the congregation of the people and praise him in the assembly of the elders. They're to give thanks publicly here, public worship, to the congregation, to the elders. Don't just keep it to yourself. Don't just express it to God, but express it to the entire community. I believe that worship can often be most powerful when it comes out of an experience like this. I know personally that some of my deepest and most emotional and moving moments of worship came out of times of stormy seas that I was in or someone that I loved was in. And the worship was just that much more real and powerful. A stormy sea. The psalmist then will conclude with the final, or really a 5th stanza or strophe of this psalm, and that is declaring that God is a God of reversal. God is a God of reversal. He can turn things around. He can change things up in a way that is both miraculous and wonderful. In verse 33, it says, he turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into thirsty ground, a fruitful land into salty waste because of the evil of its inhabitants. On the other hand, verse 35, he turns a desert into pools of water, a parched land into springs of water. And there he lets the hungry dwell, and they establish a city to live in. They sow fields and plant vineyards and get a fruitful yield, and by his blessing they multiply greatly, and he does not let their livestock diminish. When they are diminished and brought low through oppression, evil, and sorrow, he pours contempt on princes and makes them wander in trackless waste. But he raises up the needy out of affliction and makes their families like flocks. The upright see it and are glad, and all wickedness shuts its mouth. Whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord. These verses describe in general how God is one that takes chaos and creates order. He takes death and brings it to life. He takes need and brings abundance. But he can undo those as well. He can reverse that as well, because he is absolutely sovereign. And thankfully, he is good. Now, in closing, as we think about this psalm, perhaps you've already gone there, but this is one of those psalms where it's very easy to see this psalm through the lens of Jesus, to see how Jesus is the salvation of God, to see how Jesus is the fulfillment, in a sense, of what God does in Psalm 107 for each of these groups of people. When I think of the homeless and the hungry, I think of Jesus, who said, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you may also be, our home in heaven. I think of his statement in John 6:35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Jesus meets our need for home. He satisfies our hunger and our thirst. When I think of dying in prison, I think of Jesus' words in Luke 4:18, who said that God has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of the sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. That is our Jesus, the one who is a chain breaker and sets us free. When I think of the sin sick, I think of John 10. Jesus said, a thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus exchanges his life for our sin and heals us completely. And of course, when I think of a stormy sea, I can't help but think of Jesus, who on at least 2 occasions calmed the sea. He was asleep in the boat. The disciples wake him up and say, Master, don't you care? We're about to drown here. Jesus stands up and says to the wind and the waves, peace, be still. And just like that, just like this psalm, it's peaceful and quiet, and they reach their safe haven. The disciples knew this psalm. I have no doubt that when Jesus spoke those words from the boat, Psalm 107 popped in their head. Yes, this is the salvation of God. Yes, this is God. Jesus is God in the boat with us. He is our captain. When Jesus is our captain, we'll go through any storm. Anything this world has to offer us, we can handle because Jesus is in the boat with us. He is our Savior. He is the God of reversal. He is the one who turns things around, that takes care of all of our needs. And so we can say with the psalmist, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever.